What is cruelty? I think of cruelty as unjustified, voluntary behaviour which inflicts foreseeable suffering on a victim or victims. So if we unpack that, there are both moral elements, such as justification, whether the perpetrator was reasonable to do what they did, and desert, whether the victim deserved, for example, to be punished. There's also the issue of whether what the person is experiencing can actually be counted as suffering. So, for example, if you hurt somebody who can't feel pain, is that cruelty if you know that they can't feel pain? You see what I mean? It's quite complicated. So there's that issue of suffering as well. There's also the issue of whether the behaviour is voluntary. If you put a gun up against somebody's head and force them to commit a cruel behaviour, then obviously they are not as morally responsible for what they do as you are, because you are the one driving, you're the one with the intention. In that definition, that working definition, if you like, of cruelty, there are always three people. And yes, I did say three. There's the perpetrator who does the action, there's the victim who suffers, and there's someone who makes a moral judgment about whether this is cruelty or not. So what I'm saying is that you have behaviours which can be analysed in a scientific fashion, but you also have that moral element of judging whether the behaviour was reasonable, justified, deserved. Now that perpetrator can be one person or many. It can be a state, it can be a government, and in fact many of the most extreme acts of cruelty are committed by people who are working for states, for governments. Or it can be just, a child torturing a kitten. I mean, the cruelty can range from the most individual and personal, and this is of course where it differs from violence. It doesn't actually have to be physical violence. You can hurt someone very deeply with a well-chosen word. It ranges from that all the way up to these acts of extreme atrocity, but there are elements in all of those behaviours that are common. For example, the behaviour is intentional, it is foreseeable that it is going to cause suffering, it goes ahead anyway. So there's the perpetrator. There's also the victim. The victim, I'm afraid, in a lot of accounts of cruelty, for example, historical accounts, the victims often tend to find their voices rather minimised, rather left out. We focus on the perpetrators. We're interested in why they did what they did. Basically, because at a deep level, we want to know whether they're going to be a threat to us. So we're tending to focus a lot on understanding why people commit acts that we call evil, but less on how we deal with and perhaps help, let alone prevent, the victims from becoming victims. So there's the victim being the second part, and then for the third entity, if you like, in this triad, there's the observer, the judge. Now that doesn't have to be a person actually standing and witnessing the cruelty. It can be somebody who's judging it afterwards, for example in a war crimes trial, or it could be somebody much more abstract, God or history. So, for example, there's a very famous quotation that Adolf Hitler is supposed to have said when he was advocating the final solution, the destruction of European Jewry. And what he said was, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" And that was a reference to an earlier mass killing, often considered a genocide, of the Armenian people by Turkish forces. Now, leaving aside the controversy that is that historical event, Hitler's point was that people had done that and got away with it. And indeed the Germans themselves had already committed mass killings in Africa. So his argument was that basically history had let them get away with it, so there was no reason to think they wouldn't get away with it again. But he was referring to a third party, the judge, history. It could be God, it could be your own conscience. But whatever it is, there's always some sense that there's somebody looking on who's going to make that moral judgment. Now, obviously, the perpetrator and the victim also make moral judgments, but those will tend, of course, to be in opposition. And so there's always this sense of the social norms, the third party, the idea of whether this is reasonable or not. Because cruelty is often a very contested description. Somebody will say, "I wasn't being cruel, I didn't mean to." And the other person will say, "Of course you were, look what you've done to me." So there's always a third party who kind of legislates and arbitrates between those two. So that's what cruelty is.